Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Roger Ream, president of the Fund for American Studies, and we collaborate with Senator Rand Paul's office on this intern lecture series on Capitol Hill. It is supported by Steve and Nancy Einhorn of the Einhorn Family Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we're grateful to have their support. This is our 14th year doing these lectures each week on Capitol Hill for anyone interning in Washington, D.C. on the Hill or off, and for staff who might want to come and hear some great speakers. And we have 5 excellent speakers lined up. I'll just mention that next week, Senator Rand Paul will be speaking here in this room on the 17th. So please come back for that next week. But today we have an outstanding speaker. I'll just mention that the Fund for American Studies sponsors educational programs for high school and college students and young professionals around the country. If you aren't familiar with us, you can go to TFAS.org, our website, and learn more about those programs. We have 300 college students in Washington for the summer interning on Capitol Hill and in think tanks and embassies and all sorts of media organizations around Washington. And how many of you are in the TFAS program this summer? Well, a handful of you, about a dozen of you. Well, great. Thank you for joining us today. Well, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Senator Rand Paul. I know he doesn't need much of an introduction. He's the leading supporter of our Constitution in the U.S. Congress today. He has never voted for a budget that wasn't balanced. He's a defender of civil liberties. He returns money from his Senate budget to the Treasury to save taxpayers money. He serves as chairman of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, and has been a stalwart throughout his career in the U.S. Senate. He's the senator from Kentucky. Before getting into politics, he was working as a doctor of ophthalmology, graduate of Duke Medical School, and spent a lot of time not only in his private practice, but also through the Lions Club and through other organizations doing work in places like Haiti and elsewhere in the world, providing services to people that can't afford them. So please join me in welcoming Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you. What a great crowd. Thanks for coming today. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and Professor Jonathan Turley. He's a nationally recognized legal scholar who's written extensively in areas from constitutional law to legal theory to tort law. He's the author of the best-selling and award-winning book, which I highly recommend, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. Professor Turley has been part of the George Washington University faculty since 1990, where he holds the prestigious Shapiro Chair. Professor Turley has also served as counsel to whistleblowers, military personnel, former cabinet members, judges, members of Congress, and a wide range of other clients. Professor Turley has testified in front of committees over 100 times. I've had him come and testify on the law-binding use of military force. He's also testified at the hearings of cabinet members and jurists like Justice Neil Gorsuch. He appeared as an expert witness in the impeachment hearings of both Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. In 2024, the Washingtonian named Professor Turley as one of the most influential people in public policy. He's currently the legal analyst for Fox News. He's previously been the legal analyst for NBC, CBS, and BBC. Professor Turley received his BA at the University of Chicago, his JD at Northwestern. In 2008, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Law from John Marshall Law School for his contribution to civil liberties and the public interest. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Turley.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Senator Paul. I have to say that there's no expression in Parliament that it's as rare as an honest man in Parliament. And we have one exception to that expression in Washington for sure, and that is Senator Rand Paul. In all the years that I've known him, I have never once had him ask me, maybe it's because I would have very little to offer on it, but I think not. what is the most politically expedient thing to do. Every conversation I have ever had with Senator Paul is, what's the right thing to do? And he has a level of courage and integrity that the city is not accustomed to. And so it's such a great pleasure to be with him again today. Now, I've been asked to talk about my book, The Indispensable Right, and about 600 years of history of free speech in about 30 minutes. And so, as Henry VIII told Anne Boleyn, "Fear not, I shall not keep you long." It's a lot to get in, but I wanted to try to make a few points to understand what this book is about. It took me 30 years to write this book, and even then I didn't want to let it go. It took my wonderful editor at Simon & Schuster to come to my house and knock on the door and say, it just occurred to me that maybe you don't understand this about publishing. We actually have to publish the book for people to read it. And that seemed really to make sense to me. And so I finally let it go. And the reason I had a very hard time letting it go is I was trying to do something with this book that I felt was missing. And that is, I wanted to understand why we're still struggling with free speech after all of this time. Why it is that we're still debating what is free speech. And I chose the title carefully. It has two parts. The subtitle is Free Speech in an Age of Rage, but it's an age of rage, not the age of rage, because this is not our first. In many ways, we're not quite as good as our advertising when it comes to free speech. Throughout the history of this country, we've arrested people by the thousands: communists, fascists, feminists, unionists, conservatives. We've arrested them all. We've done it when we're really angry or we're really afraid. And we go through these cycles, and we've come out in each of these cycles and restored free speech. But it's a dangerous pretense to believe that we'll get through this one. It takes you. And to understand that, you have to understand the nature of rage. You know, rage is a strange thing. It's a license that allows you to do things and say things you would not ordinarily do or say. And what people won't admit is that they like it. When I was doing the coverage of the Trump trial in Manhattan, I came out after the verdict, and people were dancing in the streets. It was just pure rage. They would never admit that they liked it, nor would they admit that it's contagious. And it's not just the left, it's the left and the right. It's both parties. We live in an age of rage. And it's then, in those periods, where free speech is most at risk. But it's not the rage. This country was born in rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It was an act of rage. It's not the rage rhetoric that is the threat. It's when the government uses the rage to create state rage, to crack down on free speech. Now, the other part of the title is from perhaps the greatest justice in history, Louis Brandeis. And he wrote a beautiful opinion called Whitney, in which he talked about how free speech was the indispensable right because it's the right that we need for all other rights. You can't have freedom of religion, freedom of association. You can't have freedom of the press without the freedom of speech. So he described it as the indispensable right. But the reason I use that for the title is to capture the problem, not the promise of free speech. Because that language came in a concurring opinion where Brandeis upheld the conviction of Whitney to be sent to jail for speaking against lynchings. So what it's meant to do is to get you to wonder why is the greatest mind, perhaps, that's ever been on the Supreme Court, why even Brandeis would fail to see the irony, the hypocrisy. Because when saying that it was indispensable, he made it very much dispensable when it came to Whitney. My book is controversial with many law professors because I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I'm an old school advocate of free speech. I really do believe that the solution to bad speech is good speech. And while I've been described as a free speech absolutist, that's not true, but I admit I tolerate few limits on free speech. But the other controversial aspect is I believe that free speech is a natural right, a human right. And for most law professors who are positivists, that does not sit well. Because positivism is the idea that the legitimacy of the law is based on the fact that it was enacted duly through the legislative process. So positivists like Oliver Wendell Holmes and others believe that there's no natural right to anything. It's what society gives you. This book takes the other view. It argues that free speech is a human right. It belongs to us as human beings, not as American citizens. And it relies upon John Locke, who was the most influential philosopher on the framers. They referred to him a great deal. And the interesting thing about John Locke and his two treatises is that when he described the foundations of civilization, when he described the state of nature, he described human beings within that state of nature, before the formation of government, as having rights. Rights to things like property. Rights that came from being human, came from God, in Locke's view. Now, you can believe they either come from God, or you can believe that it's a human right because it's essential to being human. And so the question is that you can't understand free speech, in my view, which is why this book took so long, without trying to understand what a human being is. That's the problem. Because the alternative is what I call in the book a functionalist view of free speech. That's where you hear this all the time. The Supreme Court loves to do this. And as they say, we protect free speech because it has a function. It makes democracy better, right? And who can argue with that, right? It's a whole marketplace of ideas. The problem is that if you believe free speech is there for its function because it helps democracy, it means that you can have endless trade-offs. It means that some speech is good speech, some speech is bad speech. It means some speech is good for democracy, some speech is not good for democracy. This book suggests something different. It suggests that we need free speech to be fully human. One of the things I teach in my class when I teach free speech is I show this picture, which many of you will recognize as the center panel of the Sistine Chapel. It is the panel entitled God Creates Adam. And it's a beautiful panel. And part of it is responsible probably for more PhDs than any image in the history of the world. People have debated what's called the touch. What does the touch mean, right? It says God creates Adam. Is it just the spark of creation? Yes, Adam is sort of fully formed. It's not clear, is there something more to the touch than just life? And that poses a question of a different kind. It gets back to what is a human being. After all, God creates Adam. The idea was that God's creating Adam in God's image. Well, what is God? God's a creator. What I've suggested is that this is really the image of the creation of a creator. That's what we are. We have an insatiable appetite for speech, for creation, for projecting part of ourselves in the world around us. It's evident in grand things like the Great Wall of China, and in little things. When I teach a subject, I go around my class until I find someone doodling. Some of you are doodling right now. If I walked around. And when I find someone, it doesn't take long, they freak out. And I say, "Are you doodling?" They go, no, I was listening. I said, "No, I like doodling. Everyone doodles. You know, they doodle at weddings, they doodle at funerals, they doodle with goats in a boat, they doodle everywhere. And half the time, they don't know they're doodling. Half the time, we're doing doodles that are a bunch of geometric shapes that get smaller and smaller and smaller until there's just a blob of ink, right? We don't even know what we intended to have there. And yet, we do it. The question is why? Why do human beings have this insatiable appetite to create, to express? And the answer to that holds the meaning to free speech. It's found in things all around us. It's found in the image of a starving artist. You know, when Van Gogh was literally starving, he was laying on his cot in his hut, unable to get up for lack of food. And someone came and gave him a few coins to eat. And Van Gogh got up and bought more canvas and paint. Now, here's the most basic human instinct there is, to survive. And here's a starving man who takes a few coins and goes and buys canvas and paint. Now, what's interesting is that going back to that image, there was a doctor who wrote this teeny essay that has been forgotten to the ages. It's in my book, though. Because when I finally ran across it, I was enthralled. Is this doctor who decided to write an essay because he was looking at the Sistine Chapel, and he was walking out, because any of you have been there, they give you like 15 minutes. It's a total buzzkill. And then they say, get the hell out. And so he goes back with his wife and says, do you see what I see? And she says, see what? And he said, that. Why did he paint God over the human brain? What he was saying is that that's the exact outline of the human brain. He should know, he was a neurologist. He said, is that supposed to be an accident? I mean, why would Michelangelo paint the brain behind God? Now, maybe it was a total coincidence. Maybe it was not, because Michelangelo used to dissect bodies. It's one of the reasons he was such a great artist. He studied the human anatomy. But the question then is, if that's true, what do you think Michelangelo was doing? Now, one possibility, you could say, you know what, this was probably a hidden secular meaning. He's sticking a finger in the eye of the Pope, saying, it's all about humanism, God, guy. What if it's more than that? What if Michelangelo was actually talking about what is divine, about human beings? That if we really were created in the image of a creator, that's what makes us creators. That's what makes us different. So the question is, as you define what a human being is, how do we define ourselves in the context of free speech? Now, you can look at various things. We know that we are hardwired for free speech. As the book talks about, studies of the human brain show that when human beings are cut off from other human beings, when they can't express themselves, prisoners who are in segregation, explorers cut off in remote locations, their brain actually physically changes. The hippocampus actually shrinks. We need free speech so much, we physically change when we cannot use it. So then what are we? Every measure in history, we've tried to figure out that, right? Who are we? What are we? Now, obviously, you could look at our DNA, but that doesn't help much. Because we have over 98% overlap with giant apes. 98% in DNA. We have a 65% overlap with a fruit fly. And we have a 60% overlap with that. Now, does that make us talking bananas? Does that make us bananas 2.0? So obviously, we're different from bananas. Then what is it that is different about us? What is it that you could put into one sentence the difference between that and you? And if you think about it long enough, I think you will come to a conclusion that it just might be speech, creation. Now, we've learned that in hard ways. We've learned that from people like this. Now, some of you may remember from high school hearing about Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad supervisor. It fell to him when they drilled a hole in a wall, a rock face to get rid of it. They drill that hole down and they'd stuff it with TNT. And he would use that tamping iron, that very tamping iron, to tamp it down. And then you put a wire in there, get a good distance, blow the rock. Problem is, on this day, Gage, who was very highly regarded, was just a little bit sloppy. And when he tamped down, he sparked the rock. And he created the perfect cannon, and it blew the tamping iron, that very tamping iron, right through his head. Right under his chin, all the way through the top of his head. That's actually the best photo. The Harvard Medical School has all of these images, and the head of their library begged me and said, but we have great images of the entrance wound and the exit wound. And I was like, I don't know if Simon Schuster would want those. I think we're going to go with the after photo might be better. He was so disappointed. He was like, no one ever uses those photos. So here's the thing about Phineas Gage. The person that was called was just a local doctor, a Dr. Harlow, John Martin Harlow, who I think may have been one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. Because Harlow didn't rush there. He thought this was a paperwork case. After all, someone just said a tamping iron just blew through a man's head. So he thought he was just collecting the body and filling out paperwork. And when he arrived, Phineas Gage was sitting up and talking to people and making notes. And then he had what may be the single most brilliant thought in medical science history. He realized we have no idea what the front part of the brain does. No idea. But we know that guy doesn't have one. Not a complete one. So he realized if we can watch him and figure out what he could do before and what he cannot do now, it might tell us what the front part of the brain does. And what he was surprised at is that Phineas Gage could do everything. He could write, speak, work. There was only one change. As he interviewed his friends, the same word came up over and over again. They said Phineas has become an animal. That what changed is he became violent. He had a very difficult time expressing emotions. He couldn't have a relationship with anyone. And when he was denied something, he would blow up, he would fight. And they all said he's like an animal. So what was blown away from Phineas Gage appeared to be part of his humanity, the critical thing that distinguished between him and what many people associated with animals. And we now know that in that part of the brain is the portion of the brain we use for abstract thought, for expression, the things that actually make us who we are to those around us. So let's get back to the Whitney case. What is free speech? Now, Whitney was an incredibly interesting and brave woman. She was one of the early American communists. And, George Bernard Shaw once said that unreasonable people expect the world to conform to them. And then he added, that's why all history is made by unreasonable people. She was an unreasonable person. This book is basically an account of wonderfully unreasonable people. People who are really our heroes. Not the John Adams who became a hypocrite and all the rest. It's people like her. It's the communists, the unionists, the feminists, even the fascists. The people who would not shut up. You don't have to agree with their philosophy. They understood instinctively that they had a right to project part of themselves into the world around them. And Whitney's journey was an impressive one. She came from one of the most privileged families in the United States. Her family actually traced its lineage to 4 families on the Mayflower. 4. That's a level of inbreeding that's unbelievable. She was also the niece of Justice Fields. He was one of the longest standing justices of the Supreme Court. He used to spend all the summers. Then she went to Wellesley. And then Wellesley decided to take a field trip for 4 days to a settlement house in New York. They were just going to be there for 4 days. Whitney stayed for 4 months. She had never seen poverty like that. She had never seen suffering. She had never seen people in such dire conditions. And she wanted to do something about it. Now, you can disagree with where she turned, disagree with her philosophy, but you can't disagree with her motivations or her bravery. She went to California and she spoke and fought for women's rights, the right for women to vote, and she fought against lynchings. And it was one of those speeches, she was a very good speaker, where the local police told her, if you speak again against lynching, we'll arrest you. And this person of privilege, this person had very little interaction with the world before that settlement house, walked on that stage and she gave exactly that speech. And she was arrested, and she ended up in front of Brandeis, Holmes, the United States Supreme Court, and they sent her to jail. They said that speech was indispensable, but they made it very dispensable for her. The fact is, that language in the United States Constitution is the most revolutionary act of the American Revolution. No country on earth had ever used words like that before, and none have since. Even when Lafayette went to the French Revolution, tried to replicate American rights, he basically stated the same principle, but put a comma where we put a period and said, so long as it's in conformity with national laws, which sort of defeats the purpose. What makes this revolutionary is there was nothing it came from. Understand that. This came out like the head of Zeus. We took much of our Constitution from Britain. The framers liked the British system. They liked the legal system. They just didn't like how it was used. The British have never supported free speech. They still don't. Magna Carta doesn't support free speech, which was funny because I was asked to speak at the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta in London, and they never bothered. They saw I'd spoken on it. No one bothered to read any of my stuff because I was a huge critic of Magna Carta, which became clear once I arrived in London. We're like, oh. It doesn't even talk about free speech. But that did. It's still revolutionary. One of my colleagues is leading a movement to amend the First Amendment. She says that the First Amendment, it's a popular movement among law professors, the First Amendment, she says, is aggressively individualistic and should be balanced against notions like equity. And this is very popular. When my book came out, 4 books by law professors came out on free speech, all 4 anti-free speech. One of the books by a University of Michigan professor who referred to free speech as the Achilles heel of the United States, the thing that is going to kill us instead of the thing that defines us. The fact is that we've had this crisis of faith before. Some figures that I agree with are like Hugo Black, when he said that I read no law abridging to mean no law abridging. Seems pretty clear. In fact, I challenge you to find an amendment as clear as the First Amendment. It's not like all those weird Article 2 provisions, you know. This one's very clear. No law abridging. But that crisis of faith appeared early. John Adams became the greatest hypocrite ever to sit in the Oval Office. He fought for free speech and immediately used the Alien Sedition Acts to arrest his opponents, convict them. He went after journalists. Now, Jefferson pardoned all of those people, but after all, they were all Jeffersonians. But then Jefferson prosecuted people for sedition. We've had a sedition addiction in this country since its founding. You know, sedition actually came from the Star Chamber. Many people don't realize the Star Chamber was actually an anti-free speech tribunal. That's what the Star Chamber was. You see, the king tried to convict people of treason, and the English judges were largely give anything that the crown wanted, which was interesting because on this was the only thing that they seemed to be stuck on. And they told the crown, they were sort of sticklers on technicalities, which sort of drives me crazy about the English courts. They're better on technicalities. They'll do great with one tree and they'll let the whole forest burn. But, you know, this one they said, we just can't make these elements work to say that it's treason to say a bawdy joke about the queen in a pub. It doesn't work. So the king created sort of treason light called sedition, and then created a special tribunal called the Star Chamber. And the hope was that the United States would not replicate that, but we did in some small way. We're still prosecuting people for sedition prosecution. Some of the January 6th cases were sedition. This book argues that we should get rid of sedition. We don't need it. We didn't need it for the January 6th. We don't need it now. It's redundant. The people that you charged in January 6th, you were basically recharging what they had already been charged with. That it'd be better just to charge them for their conduct rather than suggesting you're convicting them of their beliefs. The only framer, and this is where my students will probably chuckle, because there's an old joke at my law school that Turley can't talk 20 minutes without mentioning James Madison. And so here you go. The only framer that was consistent was James Madison. In 1800, he wrote a wonderful thing on free speech. And it was pretty much an implied criticism of John Adams. Jefferson and Madison were so concerned about prosecutions under the Adams administration, they wrote in code. because they were worried that their letters would be intercepted and they might be charged. And Addison wrote a piece saying it's wrong about sedition. But in the middle of that, he uses a word that I kept on reading over and over again. He referred to sedition as a monster. And he's right. It's a monster that lives within us. It's a monster that we release on our neighbors when we're really afraid or we're really angry. We let the monster go. That's what an age of rage is. Now, my book talks about this picture, and I want to talk a little bit about this picture before I wrap up. When FDR gave his Four Freedoms speech, Rockwell wanted to paint them, and the White House was delighted. He was the most popular artist of his generation. And so they waited eagerly, and he sent them this painting. And they basically said, "What the hell is that? We were expecting like Washington over the Delaware, or it's a war for God's sake." And they said, who's that? And he said, it's my neighbor, Jim Egerton. Like, okay. See, Rockwell had gone to a meeting in Vermont. It was one of those local cute town meetings, and they had decided they're going to build a new school. In many ways, by the way, if I was to pick one figure that reminds me of a certain senator who's in the room, it'd be Jim Egerton. Because Jim Egerton stood up after everyone was talking about building the new school and how important it is and how much they love their children, and Jim Egerton stood up. He was actually the great-grandson of a revolutionary hero. And he said, "How are we going to pay for it?" He said, at this point, he was just a dairy farmer. But he said, "How are we going to pay for it? I don't know if I'll make it to the end of the year. I'm going to lose my farm. And many of the dairy farmers here, we're all going to lose our farms. We can't pay any more taxes. How are we going to pay it? You're saying that you're going to build a school for my kids, but you're going to destroy my farm. I have no ability to pay more taxes than I'm paying now." And Rockwell was so struck, because I think the greatest test of free speech and courage is telling the truth to your friends, probably more than your foes. And he wanted to paint that. And you know what the amazing thing is? Despite the reaction to this painting, the American people got it. They loved it. This became the most popular war bonds poster in the war. They knew exactly what Rockwell was saying. They knew exactly who this guy was, even though they'd never met him and didn't know the backstory. That was what Rockwell did. Now, not everyone was thrilled. One of his greatest critics was the art critic of the New Yorker, a guy by the name of Clement Greenberg. Clement Greenberg he said that he brought modern art to the United States. He was the one who discovered Jackson Pollock, and he would write every week about Jackson Pollock, saying, "That's art." And then he would compare it to Rockwell and say, "That's not." That he said, Rockwell's an artist that has chosen not to be taken seriously. He said, "This is kitsch, not art. Jackson Pollock is art." It was scathing. And Rockwell never responded, never did, until he did, in the way that may be the most elegant rebuttal in the history of the world. He painted that. Now, that is called The Connoisseur. It's a large painting. And he just painted that. Now, The Connoisseur is an interesting painting. It's one of the few Rockwell paintings you can't see the face of the figure. But you almost can by looking at his back. You know he's been there a while. He's got an art catalog gripped tightly in his hands. He seems to have been there a while. And from his body, from his position, you get the feeling he's looking for meaning, that he's been there just trying to figure it out, glaring, staring at this abstract painting. Now, the great thing about this, when it was unveiled in New York, Greenberg was in the audience, of course. His review had already been written, I'm sure. But so was one of the most famous abstract artists, perhaps the most famous, other than Picasso of his time. That was de Kooning. De Kooning had showed up, decided to show up. And as they unveiled it, de Kooning jumped up and said, "My God, that's better than Jackson Pollock." And he was so impressed by this, he insisted that someone get him a magnifying glass. And he went up and looked at the painting and said, "That's one of the finest abstract paintings I have seen in my lifetime." The fact is, Rockwell could do that. Many people don't realize Rockwell wrote in various styles, not the one that people associate with. He went to the best art schools of the world. He went through each of those styles. And there was one interview that really struck me in reading his papers. I came across this little interview, and it was one of the last interviews he did, and it was with a local reporter. And he was old at that point. And the reporter asked the simplest question. He said, "Why do you paint like that?" And Rockwell's answer really struck me. He said, "I painted in a lot of different ways." But he said, I went through the United States and I started to see things that many of my colleagues didn't see. Vignettes, moments that seemed to me really profound. And I wanted to paint that. I wanted to paint the America I was seeing, that people were just walking past. And so when you painted an umpire yelling at a baseball player, or a cop sitting at a counter with a child, people knew he wasn't just painting about that. He was painting about them, about something about who we are that almost escapes definition. Now, I must admit that when it comes to constitutional law, I am unabashedly Rockwellian. I think the First Amendment means exactly that. And it is profound, not simplistic. The thing is, we have many law professors, and many are my friends, who will tell you, my friends wouldn't say this, but a great number of others would, that Turley has chosen not to be taken seriously by suggesting that the First Amendment means what it seems to mean. They suggest that they are constitutional connoisseurs, that they have to interpret it for us. They have to explain that behind this language is a much more nuanced, complex, functionalist idea. It can't mean the way it was written. I think it means exactly that. And I think it's the most profound thing that has ever been written in this country or any country. Now, the question then is, how does all of this end? Well, buy the damn book and find out. No. The senator got me lunch. I owe it to him. You know, the funny thing is I was in Colorado recently, and a woman came up to me and said, "I just read your book. I really liked it, but could you end on something positive?" And I was heartbroken. It's like, I thought I was positive. And she's like, meh. So, I'll try. I feel like Woody Allen when they said, "We'd like you to end on a positive note," and Woody Allen said, "Have you seen my movies? I don't do positive." And he offered instead to give them 2 negatives to make a positive. Well, this book actually is the first of 2 books. It's actually, here's the admission, the way I finally yielded in giving them this book is I cut it in half. The second half is done. It's called Rage in the Republic, and it looks at the American democracy. Simon Schuster has decided it's going to be their book for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, so they're holding on to it, which is killing me. But that book looks at what is unique about American democracy. It looks at, the first half looks backwards at why very similar conditions, the United States and France, at the same time, revolutions that occurred right next to each other, and yet the United States turned and became the most stable, successful democracy in the history of the world, and France turned to a bloodletting known as the Terror, where thousands were guillotined. And the question is why? What was it? What was that sort of secret sauce that made the American constitutional system? The second half looks forward and asks whether American democracy can survive in the 21st century. It looks at robotics and AI and what I believe are going to be the greatest economic changes the world has ever seen. So let's get back to giving you 2 negatives to make a positive. The first negative is it's not working. You know, I just got back from Berlin at the World Forum where I spoke about free speech. I was only one of 2 free speech people there. It was the most anti-free speech group I've ever been a part of. And they were red hot because Vance had just given his Munich speech on free speech, and the EU was red hot. And so they all gathered in Berlin. Hillary Clinton was there to throw fuel on the fire. And it was odd because we had to sit next to each other at the dinner and with Bill Clinton. And since I testified at Clinton's impeachment and had written about 100 articles blasting Hillary for her free speech stance, you could have chilled cocktails off the temperature in the room. But one thing I did tell our European friends is I said it's not working. EU is the most anti-free speech body in the history of the world. The Digital Services Act is the worst attack on free speech we have ever seen. And they are trying to export it and globalize it. But it's not working. Partially it's you. I was asked by this one EU Irish member a question that was pretty leading and hostile. I asked him, how's it working for you? Let me tell you. You just tried to move one of the most anti-free speech pieces of legislation in the history of the world. And you thought you had it with the Green Party. And why did it fail? Because you assumed young people don't give a damn about free speech, and you were wrong. The people that killed the Irish measure were young Irish people. You were wrong. It's not working. See, it's very hard to get a free people to give up freedom. But they'd all assume young people just don't have that gene. I asked the same question to one of the heads of Meta. We had a debate in Philadelphia. I asked, how is it working with you? You guys paid for this creepy campaign of young people celebrating censorship, gleefully saying, hey, Facebook is doing content moderation and removing. So you spent millions and then you stopped. Why? Because it's not working. So the second negative, it's actually one of my favorite stories, which is Pandora. You know, it wasn't a box. It was a jar. Pandora's jar. But I love this story because, you know, Pandora was created. She was manufactured by Zeus, who was royally pissed off because Prometheus had given fire to humanity. So Zeus had him tied to the side of a mountain, have eagles pecking his liver out. So much for Prometheus, but he wasn't done with humanity. No, he had something special planned for humanity. He had her planned, the perfect human, irresistible, perhaps the first femme fatale. And in the jar, he put everything that would destroy humanity. He actually told her not to open the jar. But he made her too human. We're always going to open the jar. It's just a fact. We're human. And she opened the jar and she let out everything that we do to each other. Wars and hate. It all came out. We're going to continue to do harm to each other. This is not going to be our last age of rage. But what people forget about the story is the last thing that came out of the jar, which is never mentioned. It was the last thing that Zeus did not want humanity to have. The last thing that came out of the jar was hope. That's what Zeus didn't want humanity to have. So the point is only this. We're always going to be our undoing. We're humans. Rage is part of us. It goes with passion. Rage is the farthest extent of reason. But the rage doesn't define us. Free speech defines us. What defines us is that we truly believe, whether you believe in God or not, whether you believe in the touch or not, whether you believe free speech is a gift of the divine, most of us believe that we have a touch of the divine in being human. And it gives us hope. We believe that we could be better than we are. And we have been. And that's what being human is all about. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do you have questions? Oh. You want me to do questions? Oh, okay. I've been told you might have questions. I'll answer anything, no matter how sordid. Particularly if it's about Brian Kilmeade. Is this free water? Wow. From the government.
Hello, my name is Luke German. I go to school at Ashland University. I was wondering if you're familiar with Locke's idea of conscious and identity. How do you assume that plays in with AI, as you mentioned towards the end?
You're going to have to buy this new book. Actually, it went on sale for pre-orders today, which is also killing me. So Simon Schuster will sell you the book. They just won't let you read it until 2026. I'm dying here. But AI, if you don't mind me hijacking your question a bit, I spent a lot of time talking about AI and robotics in the book. I think that this country and the world is looking at the most transformative economy the world's ever seen. It is not like the Industrial Revolution. It's not like any other prior revolution. And one of the reasons is, in my view, and I try to discuss this in the book, in past revolutions, we've created more jobs than we've lost. So when we went to the Industrial Revolution, it created jobs. That is not going to be the case, in my view, with the combination of AI and robotics. The whole idea is to reduce workforce. And so we are looking at the most positive studies I could find on the replacement of workers under AI robotics was usually, one study said a ratio of maybe 6:2, that for every 6 jobs lost, we might get 2. That was on the upper end. If you just take that figure, you're looking at a massive amount of not just unemployed, but permanently unemployed, a class of permanently unemployed people. The question I raise in the book is, if that's right, what does that do for democracy? What does it do when a huge percentage of your population is under a universal basic income, is being supported by the government? How does that affect being a citizen and their relationship to the state? How can we avoid that? The book talks about the need to create what I call a liberty-enhancing economy, or a Lee model, as I call it. What a lot of people don't understand is that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations came out at the same time as the American Declaration. They came out together. And what was fascinating is that the framers and founders immediately recognized it as perfect for this country. It was incredible to read some of these accounts, because what Adam Smith was discussing about the free market seemed empowering to the founders. Because remember, you had the mercantile system, you had the English system that controlled the economy, controlled the market. What they saw was this incredible free market where people essentially could direct what goods are made, what services are provided, just by being consumers, right? And so the question is, how do you preserve a liberty-enhancing economy when you have this economic hit that's going to happen, not just in this country and globally? And so the book talks about that. AI is going to be a big part of it, because AI is a game changer. It already is. It's actually wiping out jobs right now. And one of the AI companies just said that certain fields are going to become 100% AI, even if that's not the case. Many of them will be largely wiped out. And the question is, where are those other jobs going to come from if we want a Lee model to create a liberty-enhancing economy? So that's what the book talks about. But in terms of sort of who we are as citizens, who we are as individuals, AI is a greater challenge than we have ever faced, because it does rob people of humanity, not just in having jobs. And jobs are important to people's identity. If you ask people, like my grandfather was a coal miner. And my other grandfather was a barrel maker. They didn't like those jobs. My one grandfather got black lung in the mines, was in 6 cave-ins. But to the end of his life, if you asked him, who are you? He'd say, I'm a coal miner. The job he hated the most. We're often defined by what we do. And the question is, what happens to us if we are no longer productive? And that's what the book looks at.
Hi, my name is Kate Murphy, and I go to UT Austin. And I was wondering, you said that you tolerate few limits on free speech, and I was wondering if you could tell us what some of those are to you.
I never respond to questions from UT Austin. No, I'm just kidding. No, I've always, in my book, I talk about this, that there are limits on free speech. The Supreme Court recognizes in Brandenburg that some speech has imminent violence that can occur. I'm not a big fan of the Brandenburg standard, but I think it could be actually tweaked a little better. But the idea is that that there are some types of speech that can be regulated. We've always regulated free speech to some extent. Defamation, for example, was in existence at the forming of the Republic. We've always recognized that if you use speech to harm an individual, you can be held accountable. Actually, defamation or libel actions were criminal actions back then. But the point there is that your speech is being used because you're saying something untrue, because truth is a defense, right? So if I say something untrue about Senator Paul, actually it's more difficult for him because he is a public official. So under the New York Times versus Sullivan standard, I get the benefit of a better standard. But still, if I say something that's untrue about Senator Paul, he can sue me, right? Because I'm harming him, I'm harming his reputation. That's also a limitation. But what the book argues is that we need to focus on conduct, not content. I was critical of the Trump administration in this regard. Some of these students that have been targeted, originally when they had, for example, the Cahill case, they said that they arrested Cahill for conduct, that he had engaged in criminal actions. And what I said is, okay, you just need to stick that landing. You need to show that he did commit a crime, because obviously that violates the conditions under which he's here. But right before his hearing, they switched, and they said, and I think they were going for the three-point shot. They decided it was a strong case, and they wanted to get the court to say that under the law, they could exclude you based solely on your political viewpoints. And that's what is potentially dangerous in terms of, I prefer actions to be based on conduct, not content. And much of the complaints people have, like on universities, that standard would have ended most of the problems we had. When you take over the Hamilton building in Columbia and you trash it and you assault a janitor, that's conduct. Those are crimes, okay? So that's not speech. So we can deal with these issues without punishing people for their viewpoints. Should I go way in the back? How about there? Yes.
Hi, my name is Peter Scott, and I go to Boston College. And I was wondering if you think that the current attacks we're seeing on free speech from your colleagues, from law professors around the country, if that's a natural symptom of the dominance of legal positivism in jurisprudence.
Well, the questions are fantastic. Honestly, I've been teaching for 30 years. I know. You all look at me with disgust. Yes, I'm that old. If you told me that higher education would become what it is today, I would have said you were crazy when I started. I would never have imagined it. And I feel sorry for you in many respects, as successful as you've been. When I went to University of Chicago, it was an awakening for me. It was like walking into the bar scene in a Star Wars movie. I mean, I thought, wow. I was staying I lived at a vegetarian cooperative where The Jungle was written. I actually got his room, which I thought was great, till I found out it's the worst room in the house. But downstairs, we had the Trotskyites. The Spartacus League would meet downstairs, a bunch of Trotskyites. Upstairs, we had militant vegans. Next to us, we had crazy libertarians. And I loved it all. I really did. Because I was amazed that I could see students, I could see the things that I was seeing and see something so very different. I loved talking to them, and it changed me. You simply don't have that to the same extent. Much of the dialogue at universities runs from the left to the far left. And the reason is because most faculties have been purged of conservatives and libertarians. In my lifetime, I've watched it happen. I had a debate recently with Randall Kennedy at Harvard Law School. and Randall's a friend. But we had a spirited debate. The whole point of the debate was, does Harvard respect free speech and intellectual diversity? And they picked a good person in Randall Kennedy. He did a good show of it. One of the things I mentioned in the speech in our debate, though, is I said, this country is actually a majority conservative libertarian. It's slightly over a majority. And yet at Harvard, only 3% of the faculty are identified as conservative Republican, and less than 9% of the student body. And Randall blurted out, Harvard's an elite university. We're not supposed to look like the rest of the country. And I said, Randall, you don't even look like Massachusetts. I mean, Massachusetts is like 32% Republican, right? And the point is that it's very hard to have intellectual diversity when you have purged your ranks to that extent. The Harvard Crimson, in a book I talk about this, did an interview with the last Republican in one of the main schools. The last Republican. They interviewed him like he was the last buffalo on the plains. They did everything but sort of poke him with a stick. He was 90 years old. And they asked him, what was it like, when Republicans roamed, Harvard Square? And the interview was really bitter. The guy was like, yeah, well, it was better, And but that's why I feel a bit, I think it does come from that. But there's also this idea that students have been told that free speech is harmful and triggering. And that has done more harm than anything else, is we've taught students to be afraid of free speech. And they believe it, even though I have great faith in, I think that people have underestimated the younger generation. I think they, as the Irish just found out, I think they're wrong. And believe me, I was wrong. I wasn't sure what would happen with your generation. But I have to say, I'm feeling better about it. And the thing about teaching it's harmful is that you lose that sensitivity for free speech, and you become overly sensitive then to bad speech or insulting speech. Years ago, a friend of mine, we weren't close friends, but we were acquaintances, Robert Zimmer, who was the president of University of Chicago, sent out a letter to students that had been accepted at U Chicago, where I went. And he said, congratulations on being selected. We look forward to having you join us at Hyde and Hyde Park. And he said, some of you probably feel very worried that you're going to get here and you're going to face a lot of speech and a lot of views that you're going to feel threatening and insulting. And I just wanted to assure you about one thing, is that there are no safe spaces at the University of Chicago. And you will not be protected from anything when it comes to speech. Here, we don't protect you from ideas. So if you want those safe spaces, you need to go somewhere else. I called him up when that letter went out. And I said, I've read your letter, which is now wet with my tears. And how did you come up with this? He said, I just got up in the middle of the night and wrote it. And I said, well, for God's sake, put a notebook on the side of your bed, because you do your best work, apparently. It's a brilliant letter, the Chicago letter. And some universities have now endorsed it, but not enough. About 2 months ago, I got a call from the president of a major university. I won't mention it. But he said, I finished your book, and you got me. I want to do something to reinforce free speech. I want you to tell me how. And I said, well, let's start by, why don't you endorse the Chicago letter? And he went, oh, I'm sorry, I should have specified. I'd like you to give me an idea of something I could do where I could keep my job. And I said, oh, well, that's a tougher issue. The big issue here, as I say in the book, this fight is going on. This is the most anti-free speech movement in history in this country. We've never faced anything like this. And we've never seen a coalition like this. But we won't win this fight unless we could win in higher education. And it's the hardest silo of all. And so we can't make any assumptions about anything happening anywhere else. Either we win in higher education or we lose it all. Oh, this is your last question. Okay. That's censorship. Go ahead.
Thank you for talking. My name is Lucy Spence. I go to
Oh, I'm told to make this short. It's a great question. The question was, how do you rate patriotism in the area of free speech? Let me focus on that. And it really goes to the second book. In the second book, I use Thomas Paine as the spine that runs through the book. But I actually talk about a Frenchman who adopted the name of St. John when he came over to the United States. And he wrote a pamphlet called Observations of an American Farmer. And in the pamphlet, he asks a question. This was read primarily by Europeans, particularly French citizens. And he asked this question he said, what is this American? And it's a profound question. And he asked it in all honesty. He asked, what is this American? He referred to an American as like a new creature, a new creation, and something the world had never seen before. And he's right, because we are the collection of so many different cultures. We're the only nation on earth that is entirely made up of people who came here to be an American. And the thing that binds us are not language or religion or culture. The question is, what does bind us? And yes, it is free speech, but it's this idea that we are our own greatest creation. You know, when I speak to the first-year law students, I tell them, it may sound trite, but you are the greatest creation of your lifetime. You can become anything you want. And that's a hell of a burden. But the United States is composed of citizens that came here to reinvent themselves. Thomas Paine was like that. He failed in every single thing he ever tried, in his personal life or his business life. He failed at them all. He came here destitute. And within 2 years of his arrival in Philadelphia, he was viewed as what was called the penman of the revolution. He was credited by many as the key factor in the American Revolution. 2 years. He went from destitute to being the hero of the American Revolution. So you have to ask yourself, what is an American? But it's really the question for you is what or who am I? That's what patriotism is. It's the belief that we all have a right to create ourselves, for better or worse. To me, that's all about us, is who are we? Who will you be by your own hand? Thank you very much.
All right, this afternoon we'll open up the registration for next week's lecture by Senator Rand Paul, so you can watch for that, go online and sign up for that. You'll get lunch vouchers on your way out, so leave through those doors. Anything else I need to announce? No. Professor Turley can stick around and answer a few questions we didn't get to if anyone wants to talk to him about